Good day and welcome, and thank you for either attending or if you're watching in a catch-up later. My experience of implementing skills development is it's a bit like falling down an Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole. Once involved, the minute details of the bureaucracy take over and we lose the big picture. Despite the media and everything not being perfect, many practitioners are working and making a valuable contribution. So I'm certain that the audience has far more knowledge than I do of those details. So the intention of this presentation is to take a few steps back in order to remind ourselves what we are doing and why. There are three sections, literally: the past, our present, and then questions to consider for the future. And I've created a model to help us visualize the questions in a full context. You will see the CPD questions at the beginning of each section. So this is our introduction. We need to remind ourselves, and I've suggested we do that by identifying some of the history, the signs, the hats, the language that we use. To start, the publication of Edward de Bono will be familiar to many. He produced a series of books on business strategy and applying lateral thinking in order to generate creativity and innovation in business. Just observe the hats, top hats, which I interpret as an assumption of a Western male management. So I created alternative hats. You will notice that my hats relate to work, careers, occupations, identities, collectively an occupational identity. First, we have to consider, what is identity? So, what is identity? Modern media provides us with a plethora of identities. These names are just a few, as you will appreciate. Here we're interested in occupational, vocational, organisational, and professional identities. In introductions with new people, we all have had that experience of being asked, "What do you do?" or questions about our schooling or studies. In South Africa, answers to the question about your clan will provide individuals with a detailed social identity of heritage, clan relationships, and the social positioning of the individual. During the early 1900s, Western European and USA theories of identity predominated and were initially focused on the individual, the self. These theories later developed into an understanding of the social, the interpersonal relationships were taken into account. And by the latter half of the century, theories had expanded the scope to understand that the individual is an interaction within a society, a much broader influence upon the individual, which is how we see occupational and vocational identity in the social environment of work. The terms occupational and vocational are often used interchangeably, but there are implications. Occupational identity relates more closely to the work of the individual, the tasks, the role, and a set of characteristics, which may be in employment, but also in informal work. Vocational training is used by the European community, and also our Department of Higher Education and Training refers to vocational training. That is opposed to academic. So vocational as in our TVET colleges. That seems quite straightforward, but the implications are in the lack of parity of esteem. That's Renelle Blom's quotation. In other words, how they are seen. This is not for today in detail, but a number of references are listed on the final slides, gamble on the implications of vocationalism for curriculum development? Are we training the individual for a job, or are we developing the individual? Also, Stephanie lays on the implications of the NQF structure, and Vygotsky covers the implications of the terminology. All of those are in the references for you to follow up. Unlike the respect for technical qualifications and work, such as in Germany, the key takeaway in South Africa is the low status of training at work, work-based learning, work-integrated learning, and to some extent that does follow from our legacy. Our legacy is to some extent reflected in these two graphics, and the heading there says Legacy of Occupational Identity. In fact, it is a legacy of occupational exclusion based on race and gender. The effect of that is twofold, in that the young individuals have no role models and implicitly don't believe that certain occupations are available to them. This particularly affects women. Then externally, as certain people are excluded and not trained, the impression arises that they're not able to fulfill those roles. But in fact, they have not been able to be appointed or to be trained to those roles. An interesting account that I received just yesterday before I recorded is of a young person on the YES project who will almost certainly be having the contract cancelled through, I would say, no fault of his own. He has been subject to post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the violence that he has witnessed personally of family members, including a child, being summarily executed. And he is now quite unable to get to work, despite getting opportunities of medical certificates and so on. And so exclusion is something that is more than simply exclusion from the role. The society has an influence on the individual and their ability to be appointed and successfully achieve the role. Negative views and opinions on whether someone can achieve a role are conveyed in many ways, not only in language but also in signs and in actions. One method of countering that negative is to appropriate the term. The terminology, for example, of black consciousness directly acknowledges the reality of being black at a time when that was being denigrated. Now, we've all seen the economic freedom fighters in their red overalls. The adoption of the red overall is important in that it implies I am part of you, the domestic workers, the unskilled workers. We are all part of the same. So, of importance to training practitioners, these last two slides, is to ask ourselves, do we exhibit, non-verbally or verbally, an opinion that the individual will not be able to perform? And most importantly, are we unaware that this is the message that we are conveying? Then Thabo Mbeki, a forceful statement, I am an African. That was at the time of the South African Constitution Bill being adopted. So that introduces very nicely our constitutional right to basic education, including adult basic education, and to further education. Interesting comment here that it doesn't mention skills development. And we talk of education, training, and development. Is the constitutional right limited? Adult basic education definitely forms part of skills development. That's something to be discussed. The conclusion of these last few slides, is that it's of importance to training practitioners. Do we exhibit, non-verbally or verbally, an opinion that the individual will not be able to perform? And most importantly, are we unaware that this is the message that we are conveying? These are the CPD questions for the second session. Now, the second part looks at identities. We've spoken of identity, and we can pursue that a little bit further, but we also need in our present to talk of statistics, what exists, and the structures. Organisational and professional identity clearly are the many types of organisation and the related identifications with personal life and leisure time. We see media adverts for insurance, medical aid, and particularly clothing, which all seek individuals to form an affiliation. An identity arises from the clothing, that brand. The organisation develops an identity itself, the brand, and is intended to indicate trustworthiness and attract members. Nike and young men walking down the road, caps back to front, fancy trainers, representative of their sports stars. Apple and iPads, an entirely different identity. When formal organisations seek professional registration from SAQA, their identification becomes a formally registered professional identity, both for the members and for the association. Members have an incentive to pursue the registration and continuous professional development in order to support employment or gain work contracts. Examples, other than the Association for Skills Development, are the South African Board of People Practices, and they have developed substantial human resource management standards and ethical standards. One danger of such professional identification, however, is illustrated in a recent article by Professor Rosbeth Moss-Cantor. We develop our professional status and we gain knowledge and experience which is foreign to others, effectively exclude them by the language that we use. We signal indirectly that they do not have the appropriate knowledge for the identity. Skills development has so many acronyms, we may well be speaking Klingon. Now, I have just done exactly that. For those who are not familiar with the language, Klingon was the language spoken by an alien race that was discovered by the astronauts in the Starship Enterprise in the TV series Star Trek. Our younger members can Google to make contact with that history and language. When considering exclusion, we consider unemployment. If you look at the 25 to 34-year-olds, you look at that rate, 3/4 of that group are potentially economically active. However, the economy is absorbing less than half of them. And the unemployment rate of that group is nearly double the group above it of 35 to 44-year-olds. Now, a point of enlightened self-interest here. These are the young people whose education and employment and economic contribution is what will support the retirement of the older groups. And half that population is not participating in the economy, which does not bode well for the future. What is the source of the exclusion? Clearly relates to educational level. The latest figures from ASDSA demonstrate how privilege still equates to educational attainment and educational attainment to privilege. There's a clear correlation between graduate and some tertiary education and their employment rate. And for the matrics, their unemployment is 29.7%, almost a third. Now the challenge for ASDA is how to upskill those who have achieved grade 12. There may be criticisms of the low percentage needed to pass or the quality of their education, but they have stayed the course despite the difficult economic circumstances we know exist. And I provided you with the example of that young man traumatized by his environment and the violence in his environment. So the question from these two slides taken together is, what can be done for them? How can they be integrated into skills development? Can they be included as 18-2s in learner projects somehow or other? Can we have them included? One final point on unemployment. Why is it so high? That is the debate. And there are two main streams to the debate. The one is that it derives from labour law. And the Centre for Development and Enterprise, CDE, that is their publication recently. Now, personally, I am extremely jaundiced about that theory, because in the past, when I have asked small employers and so on, when they tell me it's a big problem with labour law, and I say to them, which specific labour law is tripping you up? Which specific section of which specific law? They have never been able to quote. Definitely not a section and not a law. So it's more a thing that exists in the environment, a media thing that exists, that people know that there's a problem. Personally, I can think of one law, and there's a few sections in the one place dealing with one issue that is a problem. I would agree there, but I'm not telling anybody what it is. The alternative theory is human capital, our people, and that is something in a recent publication also referenced, Markle and Cilliers, and they are talking about human capital. And when you think about the example that I quoted of this young man, now effectively excluded from the skills that were potentially available and possibly excluded from the economy for the future, you start to see that human capital and developing human capital is more than just running some training courses. It's far more than that needs to be taken into account in how to develop the population. It's a much bigger question to achieve inclusion. This slide is just a quick reminder of our current National Skills Development Plan 2020 to 2030, issued by Minister Naledi Pandor when she was there, and the point that she made when she issued this National Skills Development Plan was she indicated that it integrates with the National Development Plan. So the point is that the skills development integrates with the needs of the economy. Our challenges: unemployment, poverty, and inequality. And the plan aims to meet the needs of the economy with the identification of scarce skills and development skills. That's our contribution. Now you'll see that I've quoted National Qualifications Framework Amendment Act, not quite in place yet. In desperate times, people take desperate measures. And so falsifying a qualification seems quite a viable route to go in order to get work. And the National Qualifications Framework Amendment Act does aim to help us reduce that as a problem. This slide is also just a quick summary. The Quality Council for Trades and Occupations, QCTO, develops the qualifications and part qualifications, and they issue occupational certificates. The SAQA, South African Qualifications Authority, though the policy connects the qualifications and the occupations. And changing jobs does not necessarily mean that changing occupational identity. So we have some illustration of the size of the problem and those not included in the economy. This is the end of this section, and the following section asks some further questions about what can be done. These are the CPD questions for this third section. This final section talks about the future, bringing together the challenge of the fourth industrial revolution with skills development and the association identity. The fourth industrial revolution I am not going to cover at all. It was very comprehensively dealt with by Suzanne Hutting last year. I just want to point out, though, if I can get to the pen, I just want to point out the issue here of ethics and identity and of this disruption to jobs and skills. Now, those 2 points are relevant to us. Now, I've taken a long rambling road through our legacy, our current challenges, and our key structures to bring to you a model that I would like to suggest brings all our trees and our forests together. I've created a template, and I'll give a very brief introduction to the theory that underlines the template so we can move on to the model. The template is based upon applying cultural historical activity theory, or an interpretation of it. Vygotsky was a psychologist working post the Russian Revolution, and he developed a concept of mediated action. Now, this moves human action away or further on from the simple stimulus response. Humans have the ability to respond in different ways to instructions or directions, and they use the cultural tools in the environment, such as language or signs. So individual actions take place in that social context, and the actions are part of larger activities. There are references to follow up if you are interested. I would just like to quote an example from my work experience to illustrate this point. When I was a junior personnel officer, I was responsible for various branches working at Unilever. So I was in Cape Town, and I was responsible for East London, Port Elizabeth, Bloemfontein. And we had an instruction from overseas because we were EEC Code of Conduct signatories. And the instruction was we were not allowed to have any of those signs that said nie blankes or blacks, no blacks and whites and so on the toilets. And so I was dispatched to travel around the country to check those signs had been removed. I arrived in Bloemfontein, and the manager took me to the area, and we looked at the doors, and I could see there were 2 squares where the wood was showing through. It hadn't been repainted. There was blue doors, I think. And I said to him, "Oh, that's excellent. I see you removed the signs." And he said to me, "That's fine. We still know which one's which." So I'm sure there'll be many consultants and so on who can relate to that in terms of giving advice and so on, and the recipient does not respond as you expected. This is the template which I've drawn up based upon Vygotsky's theory. We have a subject and an object, and the ability to use various language cultural tools or actual tools to achieve an outcome. However, this is taking place in a social context, so there are rules, there's a community of practice doing the activities, and those activities are divided. There's a division of labor, what is being done. So I tried to use that to consider what we are doing. Now, to develop our model from our template. We have our members, professional identity and designations. They're implementing skills development. They approach the employer. We are implementing workplace-based training. We have a range of language, tools, and methods to do that. Leave that aside for a moment. This is what we're trying to achieve. a skilled and capable workforce. National Skills Development Plan is integrated with the National Development Plan. However, we are in a social environment, so we have the rules provided by SACPA, QCTO, DHEG, CETA. We have our professional bodies and our division of labour. Returning to the top to ask ourselves, what do we use to achieve our ends? So the members obtain personal qualifications, familiarity with the language, acronyms, remember, Klingon, and stay current via CPD, CETA workshops to remain current on what is any particular year. The requirements change annually. And then in the response, the employer may appoint internal and external SDFs, training providers and consultants to implement projects and interventions. One response is not to participate. One of the generators of participation is the broad-based Black economic empowerment. The Skills Development Levy refund, somebody explained to me just this week that they had lost clients when it went down from 50 to 20. It no longer was viable. So having created the model and returning all the way back to the original question, are we set up and do we have what we need to proceed? That is the basic question. So I have generated 3 sources of question for thought and discussion. One is, we know that the Fourth Industrial Revolution will go very fast. It is going fast and it will no doubt continue. And so the question from our CPD designation perspective is, do we have what we require and will it prepare us to unlearn and relearn? Then secondly, also from a Fourth Industrial Revolution perspective, the rules that we have, our rules for developing qualifications, assessing performance, credentialing people, is that fast enough? Is that adequate? And will it meet the future needs? And then finally, we start from this legacy of exclusion. So does skills development in this present landscape, does it encourage inclusion? Are medium and small employers encouraged to participate, or are they excluded? Those are my questions, and we may have a chance to discuss them, or you may follow up the references and develop your own theories thereafter. Thank you for listening. Thank you for participating. I would like to particularly thank Morena for requesting me to prepare this presentation, and also Angelique for facilitating my skills development, which has been extensive in this week. Thank you, Angelique. Thank you, Morena.